tenantry. For about $45, a man could get a farm of 160 acres on the installment plan. Another payment of $80 was due in 40 days, but a 4-year term was allowed for the discharge of the balance. With a capital of from $200 to $300, a family could embark on a land venture. If it had good crops, it could meet the deferred payments. It was, however, a hard battle at best. Many a man forfeited his land through failure to pay the final installment. Yet, in the end, in spite of all the handicaps, the small freehold of a few hundred acres at most became the typical unit of Western agriculture, except in the planting states of the Gulf. Even the lands of the great companies were generally broken up and sold in small lots. The tendency toward moderate holdings, so favored by Western conditions, was also promoted by a clause in the Northwest Ordinance declaring that the land of any person dying intestate, that is, without any will disposing of it, should be divided equally among his descendants. Hildreth says of this provision, "It established the important Republican principle, not then introduced into all the states, of the equal distribution of landed as well as personal property." All these forces combined made the wide dispersion of wealth in the early days of the 19th century an American characteristic in marked contrast with the European system of family prestige and vast estates based on the law of primogeniture. The Western Migration and New States. The people. With government established, federal arms victorious over the Indians, and the lands surveyed for sale, the way was prepared for immigrants. They came with a rush. Young New Englanders, weary of tilling the stony soil of their native states, poured through New York and Pennsylvania, some settling on the northern bank of the Ohio, but most of them in the lake region. Sons and daughters of German farmers in Pennsylvania, and many a redemptioner who had discharged his bond of servitude, pressed out into Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, or beyond. From the exhausted fields and the clay hills of the southern states came pioneers of English and Scotch-Irish descent, the latter in great numbers. Indeed, one historian of high authority has ventured to say that the rapid expansion of the United States from a coast strip to a continental area is largely a Scotch-Irish achievement. While Native Americans of mixed stocks led the way into the West, it was not long before immigrants direct from Europe, under the stimulus of company enterprise, began to filter into the new settlements in increasing numbers. The types of people were as various as the nations they represented. Timothy Flint, who published his entertaining Recollections in 1826, found the West a strange mixture of all sorts of conditions of people. Some of them, he relates, had been hunters in the upper world of the Mississippi, above the falls of St. Anthony. Some had been still farther north, in Canada. Still others had wandered from the south, the Gulf of Mexico, the Red River, and the Spanish country. French boatmen and trappers, Spanish traders from the southwest, Virginia planters with their droves of slaves mingled with English, German, and Scotch-Irish farmers. Hunters, forest rangers, restless bordermen, and squatters, like the foaming combers of an advancing tide, went first. Then followed the farmers, masters of the axe and plow, with their wives who shared every burden and hardship and introduced some of the features of civilized life. The hunters and rangers passed on to new scenes, the homemakers built for all time. The number of immigrants. There were no official stations on the frontier to record the number of immigrants who entered the West during the decades following the American Revolution. But travelers of the time record that every road was crowded with pioneers and their families, their wagons and cattle, and that they were seldom out of the sound of the snapping whip of the teamster urging forward his horses or the crack of the hunter's rifle as he brought down his evening meal. During the latter half of 1787, says Coman, more than 900 boats floated down the Ohio carrying 18,000 men, women, and children, and 12,000 horses, sheep, and cattle, and 650 wagons. Other lines of travel were also crowded, and with the passing years, the flooding tide of homeseekers rose higher and higher. The Western Routes. Four main routes led into the country beyond the Appalachians. The Genesee Road, beginning at Albany, ran almost due west to the present site of Buffalo on Lake Erie through a level country. In the dry season, wagons laden with goods could easily pass along it into northern Ohio. A second route, through Pittsburgh, was fed by three eastern branches, one starting at Philadelphia, one at Baltimore, and another at Alexandria. A third main route wound through the mountains from Alexandria to Boonesboro in Kentucky, and then westward across the Ohio to St. Louis. A fourth, the most famous of them all, passed through the Cumberland Gap, and by branches extended into the Cumberland Valley and the Kentucky country. Of these four lines of travel, the Pittsburgh route offered the most advantages. Pioneers, no matter from what section they came, when once they were on the headwaters of the Ohio and in possession of a flatboat, could find a quick and easy passage into all parts of the West and Southwest. Whether they wanted to settle in Ohio, Kentucky, or western Tennessee, they could find their way down the drifting flood to their destination, or at least to some spot near it. Many people from the South as well as the northern and middle states chose this route. So it came about that the sons and daughters of Virginia and the Carolinas mingled with those of New York, Pennsylvania, and New England in the settlement of the Northwest Territory. The methods of travel into the West. Many stories giving exact descriptions of methods of travel into the West in the early days have been preserved. The country was hardly opened before visitors from the Old World and from the Eastern States, impelled by curiosity, made their way to the very frontier of civilization and wrote books to inform or amuse the public. One of them, Gilbert Imlay, an English traveler, has given us an account of the Pittsburgh route as he found it in 1791. "If a man," he writes, "has a family or goods of any sort to remove, his best way, then, would be to purchase a wagon and team of horses to carry his property to Redstone Old Fort or to Pittsburgh, according as he may come from the northern or southern states. A good wagon will cost at Philadelphia about £10, and the horses about £12 each. They would cost something more at Baltimore and at Alexandria. The wagon may be covered with canvas, and if it is the choice of the people, they may sleep in it of nights with the greatest safety. But if they dislike that, there are inns of accommodation the whole distance on the different roads. The provisions I would purchase in the same manner, that is, from the farmers along the road. And by having 2 or 3 camp kettles and stopping every evening when the weather is fine upon the brink of some rivulet, and by kindling a fire, they may soon dress their own food. This manner of journeying is so far from being disagreeable that in a fine season it is extremely pleasant." The immigrant once at Pittsburgh or Wheeling could then buy a flatboat of a size required for his goods and stock and drift down the current to his journey's end. The admission of Kentucky and Tennessee. When the 18th century drew to a close, Kentucky had a population larger than Delaware, Rhode Island, or New Hampshire. Tennessee claimed 60,000 inhabitants. In 1792, Kentucky took her place as a state beside her none too kindly parent, Virginia. The Eastern Federalists resented her intrusion, but they took some consolation in the admission of Vermont because the balance of Eastern power was still retained. As if to assert their independence of old homes and conservative ideas, the makers of Kentucky's first Constitution swept aside the landed qualification on the suffrage and gave the vote to all free white males. 4 years later, Kentucky's neighbor to the south, Tennessee, followed this step toward a wider democracy. After encountering fierce opposition from the Federalists, Tennessee was accepted as the 16th state. Ohio. The door of the Union had hardly opened for Tennessee when another appeal was made to Congress, this time from the pioneers in Ohio. The little posts founded at Marietta and Cincinnati had grown into flourishing centers of trade. The stream of immigrants, flowing down the river, added daily to their numbers, and the growing settlements all around poured produce into their markets to be exchanged for store goods. After the Indians were disposed of in 1794, and the last British soldier left the frontier forts under the terms of the Jay Treaty of 1795, Tiny settlements of families appeared on Lake Erie